Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Hello to anyone who's listening on the Temple Beth Am podcast. We are deep into Parshat Bo. We got halfway through a Rashi on the second verse, so we're almost done with the Parsha. I will read verse 2 again to get us going, and then we'll pick up halfway through the Rashi. Rashi said half of what he had intended to say on the root ayin lamed lamed of the word hitalalti in that verse. Let's go to the verse itself. Just because we're at the very beginning of the parsha, let me read the first two verses to get us going. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, God said to Moses, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh, ki ani chbadati libo, for I have strengthened, hardened, made severe his heart, ve'alev abadav, in the heart of his servants. Laman, why? In order to shiti ototai ele berkibo, that I place my signs in his midst, meaning my intent here is to flash my authority and my power. And now another ulaman, our verse, and also in order to saper bioznei vincha ubein vincha, that you will have something to tell into the ears of your children and your children's children, et asher hitalalti, all that I have allowed, and I'm going to untranslate it for now, upon Egypt, and also my signs that I placed upon them, v'yidatem ki ani Adonai, and you will know that I am God. Right. So here in one verse, well, really in 1.5 verses, God lays out very compactly the two principal rationales internal to the Torah, right? This is pre-Midrash, for why this entire Exodus process takes this much time, to punish the Egyptians so that they will feel my severity, and so that you'll have a good story to tell, so that 2,000, 3,000 years from now, you'll still be telling it, and guess what? We are. Okay, so Rashi focused on the word hitalalti. We discussed that the root is ayin lamed. Lamed, it's in a hitpael. It's a weird hitpael because the meaning doesn't seem to be reflexive. And almost always, not always, almost always, second sentence in, when something is in the hitpael, then the action of the verb is being done kind of to the person who is the subject of the verb. So asher hitalalti, that which I have allowed, but whatever the word means, it's upon Egypt. So it's not something that God is doing to God's self, right? I think we mentioned this last week. If not, then I'll mention again that the most common hitpael word that a lot of people who don't know Hebrew that well know is the word to pray, lehitpalel, right? And you might say, well, what's reflexive about lehitpalel? The root palal actually means to judge or to assess. So lehitpalel means to assess yourself, to judge yourself, right? The aspect, the concept of prayer is actually to be involved in an internal reflexive process. We don't translate it that way, but that's what it means etymologically, and that's probably what it should mean in terms of the experience we're meant to have. Yeah, Alan and then Rick?
I'd been taught years ago that the shorish pel lamed lamed was to petition oneself. It was an act of petition. Does that jive with what?
No. Palal mean plilim are guilty ones. Palal, I mean, in general, that root means guilty or responsible or having done something they shouldn't have done. To petition, that's lehit chanein is to petition, but lehit it might have turned into that as a word for word translation, but it's not what the root means. I don't think. Could be wrong.
So tell me again what the root means.
Having to do with guilt or criminality or something that you did that you ought not have done. You go ahead, Leonard.
Hi. According to Klein's dictionary over here, there are two pei lamed lameds. One meaning to judge, to arbitrate, and the other one meaning to pray.
Right. So, but the question is, does it mean to pray because it means to pray, or does it mean to pray because what prayer actually is to judge oneself?
No, what I'm saying is that the root is listed twice. So according to this dictionary, those roots are not related.
According to BDB, that's not the case. Surprise, surprise, philologists don't agree with each other all the time. Palologists, Rick. Thank you. I'll be here all week.
And then I like lahita tef because when I'm teaching the kids the talit, and the word atifa, I found out what it means envelope.
Put the mic almost.
So you're enveloping your. It's too loud. Yeah. Okay. You're enveloping yourself, lahita tef. So and lahit raot, I love until we see each other. The ro'eh in there.
Right.
So I don't know how that relates to hitalalti, but
right.
I love those two reflexive verbs.
It certainly doesn't operate reflexively in the verse, but because whatever the verb means, it's God saying that I want you to have a story to tell about that which I did to the Egyptians, but the form is hitpael. And is this correct? Yeah. And if you look at Unkelis doesn't even translate it as a reflexive verb. So if you look at the Unkelis on verse 2, uvedil de tishta'e, in order that you tell, kodam barach, in front of your son, barach like bar mitzvah, son, bar, uvar barach, and the son of your son, yat nisin, all of the miracles, di avadid, that I did. He just turns it into a plain, as if the Hebrew word et asher asiti, right? He's saying, pay no attention to that reflexive form. This just means what I did, right? Now, Rashi first tells us what he thinks that the meaning of the root is, rather than focusing on the form. And he turns hitalalti into sichakti, played with in terms of toying with, like the way a cat might do to a mouse, right? And then, again, we did this last time, and then he brings us to a verse in the book of Bamidbar, where there's also a reference back to this moment, ki hitalalta bi, that you have toyed, sorry, not this moment, Bilam, castigating the donkey for making fun of him. Halo kasher hit alel behem. So that's as far as we got, and that's just a long intro into what we're about to do. Rosemary, can we pass Rosemary the microphone?
While you're reading the sentence, it took my attention. Why is God telling Moses that you're going to talk to Pharaoh and I have hardened his heart? If you're sending an emissary to somebody, you aren't going to tell him, I have intentionally hardened his heart, so he's going to refuse you. So I think Moses' job here, psychologically, is more difficult. What's he going to do? Play God's part? Is it to make the story longer as an author, like you want bigger book, or is there something there?
Go to Pharaoh, and guess what? He's no interest in seeing you. Right? Guess.
Rabbi, we can't really hear Rosemary.
Everyone in the room is going to have to put the microphone closer to their mouths. So she said that it seems that God is telling Moses to go to Pharaoh, and then he says, and why am I telling you to go to Pharaoh? Because I've hardened his heart. It seems counterintuitive, right? That I've hardened his heart, which means that your job is now harder. So why are those two things connected? It's if you send an emissary to go do a task, you want to tell the emissary that that you've made the task easier for that person, not hard for that person. Interesting, Rick.
And Moses is also talking to everybody in court, right? Pharaoh isn't sitting there by himself. It's the audience is the whole government.
Yeah. Okay, that's how far we got. Let's go into the second half of the Rashi. We got to Halo Kasher Hidalel Behem, which is a verse from all right, we looked at the verse in the book of Samuel, which also refers back to things that the Egyptians had done. Okay, so we're picking up the words Ve'enu Lashon. Let's see. Tova, do you want to pick up Ve'enu Lashon? We're about 10 words into the Rashi on Hidalalti. Okay, Rebecca, you want to read? Take a microphone. And really hold it close to your mouth.
Ve'eno lashon fo'al uma'alalim she'im kain haya lo lichtov olalti kamo in echa.
Okay, so I've told you what it does mean, and resist the urge to understand it another way that the root ayin lamed lamed might mean something. And what is that? And it's not the language of po'el uma'alalim. Po'el means
action
or doing something.
Doing something.
And
So it's not
ma'alalim,
deeds is what this translates.
deeds or things, right? We talked about how in literature, an alilah in Hebrew, I think, is a plot. It's stuff, right? So the root alal can mean to play. It also could it can mean a version of how Uncle has translated it. Asiti, the stuff that I did. Rashi says, don't translate it that way. Because had it meant that, this is where Rashi gets into the structure, it would not have been, I'm adding here, it would not have been a reflexive. It would have been a pa'al verb, she'im kain.
For if so, it should have been written olalti.
Right. Had the Torah wanted this root to be in a form that just meant the things that I did, there's a perfectly good Hebrew word for I did using the root letters ayin lam and lamed, and it's olalti. It would have been et asher olalti b'mitzrayim, not hit alalti, kamo.
Like in Echa.
Okay, so read that verse.
Ve'olel lamo ka'asher olalta li, asher olal li.
Okay, so look at the screen. This is from the first chapter of Echa, Book of Lamentations. Read on Tisha B'Av. Tavo kol ra'atam lefanecha. Let all the things evil that they did go in front of you. Ve'olel lamo, and deal with them. This olel is not to play or toy, just do to them, the wicked ones, ka'asher olalta li. All the things you have done for me. This is basically Jerusalem, as it were, or the people embodied by Jerusalem, telling God how miserable you've made me. All the things, olalta li, olel lamo, do it to them, right? So it's a severe form of doing, but it's not a toying or a playing. And then it's also above in verse 12. Lo aleichem kol ovrei derech. All of you who are passing the road and seeing me, again, this is Jerusalem speaking, may it not ever be upon you. Habitu uru, look and see. Im yesh machov kamachovi, does anyone have pains like I have? Asher olal li, that was done, or that the unmentioned subject, either God or the universe or the Babylonians, did to me. So Rashi says, had the Torah wanted to use this root to mean to do, it would have been olalti, exactly as it was in Echa. The fact that it was hit alalti suggests that it means something different. Rick?
In the first verse, if you could go back to it, it was nice. It also mentions heart there, libi. I noticed at the end, my heart is sick, libi davai. Just thought it was nice, talking with Pharaoh's heart.
Got it. Yeah. Rashi ends there. He doesn't expand on it. He just says, you reader might be more used to this root meaning something prosaic, to do something. It does mean that in a different form. In the reflexive, Rashi doesn't explain how he derives this. He just gives us a verse from Midbar where it's similar. In the reflexive, it means to toy with or play with, even though that's not a reflexive idea. Okay, comments, thoughts? Joel? Give Joel the microphone.
We talked about last week why it says Bozne. I could have just said Tisaper Levincha.
Yeah. What would you want to say about it?
I mean, I have a theory, but
Go ahead.
No. I mean, well, if first of all, it paints a picture. Like if you say Tisaper Levincha, then you picture sitting down, a kid from the age of 5, and you're teaching him the story. Whereas if you say in the era of, it paints a picture of, like, from the minute they're babies, you whisper the story over and over and over again. And the gematria is 70. I don't know what that means.
The gematria of Be'oznei.
Yeah. So it's like 70 is like a normal lifespan. So it's they're in every every day of their lives or something.
Very nice. Very nice, Joel. Interestingly, Unkelist translates it without that nuance, right? Unkelist translates the Bosne as to kadam, in the presence of, right? He takes out the possibility of reading into the talking into the ears, but I like your read better. Yeah, it seems very intimate to tell something directly to their ears. Yeah, very nice. Okay, anything else before we go to verse 3? Stevie, let's give the microphone.
I mean, with all due respect to Rashi, if there's something nice about the idea of God saying, I did something to myself in Egypt, and I also did something to the Egyptians, and you should tell both stories. And I think that we try to do that when we tell the story at Pesach, right?
What is it that you're suggesting God did to God's self?
Well, the word is hard to unravel, to
Right.
be sure, but he's allowed to, whatever it means, it's something God did to himself in Egypt. It's like,
Meaning trying to preserve the reflexive nature of it.
yeah.
I'm trying to see if anybody of the translations does anything with the reflexive nature of it. Everett Fox says, here, I'll share the screen. Oh, it's already being shared, right? Yeah. I have been capricious with Egypt. Interesting, lovely word. It's not reflexive. Dealt harshly with, made fools of. The made fools of is really how Rashi's reading it. Let's see, JPS, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians. That's Rashi. Korin, what things I have done. So interesting. Korin reads it very plainly, just like Unkelist did. He basically disagrees with Rashi. It's just the version of alal, which means to do things. Mitsuda made a mockery. Earlier JPS made a mockery. Shraga Silverstein, of my setting Egypt to scorn. Interesting. Early JPS. What I have wrought upon Egypt, also very plain. And then let's see how Kahana reads it. I have mocked. Larry, do you have any? Do Kaplan or Alter translate Hitalalti interestingly at all?
Yeah, both of them. Alter is how I toyed with Egypt,
Okay, that's Rashi.
and Kaplan is made fools of.
Uh-huh. So both of them heading in the Rashi direction, no one really attempting to translate this in a reflexive way, right? So Rashi could be wrong, and Rashi could also be right, which is that there are certain situations where a root is in a reflexive form, and it's not a reflexive meaning. Rick and then Barry. What's that? You'll give what a go?
Another translation. So if the earth belongs to God and he's messing with Egypt's land and he's moving the insects over here and blood over the water there, then he's messing with his creation.
So
Maybe.
I'm doing this so that you can tell your descendants all the ways in which I was kind of willing to muck up my grand creation in Egypt in order to get you out. Great.
Yeah.
Barry, then Rachel.
Picking up Stevie, your comment about what God did to God's self. God is holding back from God's power to deal with it, all of it, by the way, rather allowing, like a cat and a mouse, allowing the Egyptians to mockery themselves. And that's the reflexive comes in. God holds God's self back so that Egypt mocks itself.
Larry, Diane. Oh, Rachel, sorry.
I was thinking back to the hardening of the heart and the difficulty of that concept. Why God hardens Pharaoh's heart in order to demonstrate various dimensions of God's power. And that the hardening of the heart, like over and over again, I'm thinking that might have to do with this making a mockery of God's self along with the Egyptians. It's kind of a paranoid fantasy that this one or that one is laughing at you while you are experiencing anything. And it's just this idea that God is mocking God's self while also putting the Egyptians through all these plagues. That's it's uncomfortable, and it's a very different view of the divine.
Yeah, and there are moments in Torah and certainly in Midrash where we have a presentation of a divine who changes the divine mind, who regrets, who is somehow humbled, even though God also represents all the things that are grand. We could spend another hour on this and we still wouldn't resolve it. It's a fascinating word for people who know Hebrew grammar. It's fascinating that no one translates this reflexively, and it opens up the possibility. Was there a translation out there that people just didn't want to go to because they were uncomfortable with the notion, even though that may be what it meant? What did it mean when it was originally given as a word? We don't know. I see Laird, Diane, Marshall, and Stevie, and then we're going to go forward.
I'm along the lines of Rachel's thinking, but I'm looking at it also in terms of the punctuation, which doesn't exist in the Torah, but we've all given to it, including the trope, and then the logic of the two verses together. So first of all, just about the punctuation, we start off with uleman, which connects then the two verses, and almost all of the translations are and that, or so and so that, except for Kaplan, who actually has a period after the first verse, and then says, "You will then be able to confide to your children and grandchildren." But even that doesn't help me a whole lot. What's the logic of the two verses together? God is telling Moses that he has to tell Pharaoh that he hardened his heart and hearts of his courtiers, and he did that so that he's going to be able then to display these signs. And then God continues, and he says, "And I did these things," hardened his heart, "so that you can recount to your children what is it?" And then we get to this your question about what the word really means. And yet, most of when we talk about, I know this is not the verse that we use, telling your children, we're not supposed to be telling our children what a jokester, trickster, mocker God is. We're supposed to tell our children about the power of God. So I don't have an answer, but I'm just, like Rachel, really uncomfortable with these two verses.
Yeah, you're reinforcing a potential disconnect or a dissonance between the second rationale, so you have a good story to tell, and the way the story is being told in this verse, which is one of hitalalti, which, if we believe Rashi, is God almost as a maniacal toyer of people, as opposed to primarily just being interested in getting the Israelites out of Egypt. Yeah.
Right. This may sound completely off base, but it reminds me of something that happened to us this weekend where someone told us, "Oh, this comedian is very funny. Go see this comedian." We expected to see social commentary, and instead we all we got was offensive comedy, something that offended us. So if I'm listening to someone tell me the story about God, I might say, gee, that's not a deity I want to follow. He's a cruel, he's a cruel deity, not a deity who's ultimately trying to free his people.
Yeah. Let's linger on in a second and remember for the 10,000th time the translation problem, because even as we're using words in English, even the words that we're using in English have multiple shades of possible meaning as we're trying to figure out what the original Hebrew word meant. There are the notion of mocking someone seems to be abjectly cruel. The notion of defeating someone so soundly that in the eyes of others they are a mockery, that's a little bit different, right? So just to go to the present tense, would I find it satisfying if at the end of this horrific war that Hamas was made a mockery of, and that the world understood the extent to which they were so roundly defeated, and they were a mockery in the world's eyes? I would consider that to be a virtuous victory, which is different than toying or teasing for the sake of being cruel. So you could say back to your response, Larry, that yes, God says to Moses, I do this for two reasons. One, to show Pharaoh my power, and for your descendants to know the extent to which I was so overwhelmingly powerful that when I was done with them, Egypt was a nothing. It's subtly different, right? And that can work in hit alalti. The ways in which kind of I forced them, I directed this movie such that at the end of it they were a mockery, and I did this in Egypt, which is not God as, again, abjectly cruel, but God as being just a sound defeater of a vicious enemy. These are very subtle shades of meaning, and it's all guesswork because we don't know. Do we have Stevie's hand up, or Marshall? Marshall was next.
Yeah, Robert Alter points out an interesting contrast. If we go back to chapter 9, verse 16, which is in the Parshat Va'era, where it says, "Ulam ba'avur zot ha'amaticha ba'avur harotecha et kochi l'man tisaper shemi b'kol ha'oretz." Here God is talking to Pharaoh. He says, I have spared you for this purpose.
Marshall, can you speak a little louder, please?
Make the microphone perpendicular to your face.
Okay. Is that better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, this is in chapter 9, verse 16, where God says, addressing Pharaoh, I have spared you for this purpose, in order to show you my power, in order that my fame may resound throughout the entire world. So here the emphasis is God is the universal God, right? In contrast, this is where Alter points out. He said that the rationale of establishing God's enduring fame shifts here in our section now in chapter 10 from the global scope of Exodus 9:16 to a consideration of educating the future nation, and that's not only tell your son but also your son's son.
Yeah.
Confirming the Lord's supremacy throughout the world might be viewed as a kind of monotheistic ideal, though not a very realistic one. And here, he points the point, the particular importance of the Exodus story is that it served as a foundational narrative for the nation.
Right, and that these are the verses that begin to make the case that what's happening in this moment is not just important for this moment. What's happening in this moment, meaning the contemporaneous moment in the story, is going to be important forever, right? Up until now, right, again, if you're reading the story for the first time, up until now, we're dealing only with the present tense. This is an enslaved people that's trying to get out, and there's no looking forward yet. But now, as we're getting towards the end of the plagues, we're beginning to see the Torah tell the story in such a way that the story continues to be a story, which, again, is how it happened. Yeah, Stevie?
So first I'll say that I was skimming through some of the commentaries, and Shadal points to a number of verses where it's in the reflexive, but it's clearly means to embarrass or belittle or something that's and not reflexive. But what I was more aiming for with my previous comment was in several of the commentaries, and follow Unclus and say it means something like just acted, right? Rashbam says, "Pulot alilot," right? Just like doing things.
Right.
But if you make that reflexive, the idea that, right, it's like a coach in a sports game saying, like, now get into the game. That God was like, I was sitting on the sidelines for a long time, and then in Egypt, I decided to, like, be more active in how I run the world. I think that's what I was hoping for, though it may not linguistically be valid. But
got it. Tova, and then Rick, was your hand up again? Your hand was up a little bit. You're like not sure if you want to say it. Go to Tova first. Yeah. I want to see if by the time Tova's done, your hand is up all the way.
I'm thinking that a lot of times language, not only in Egypt, but in other countries, when you talk about mockery, is referring to really the mockery of the gods of that country. And when you have a scenario where that country appears to be losing, or in Egypt, it was if Thebes was losing in a war, then it was perceived that its gods were somehow weaker and being mocked literally by the other gods. And that's sort of what this feels like, that in a sense, God is setting up a scenario in terms that Egypt would understand, because that's the dynamics historically over time as gods rise and fall, that the gods are being mocked. They're being revealed to be impotent. And Pharaoh, especially at this time in history, near divine himself, but certainly an intercessor, also being shown to be impotent. So on one hand, it can be a message of the universal nature of this God, the true God, or in a pragmatic sense, that your gods are not going to be able to stop you from what's going to happen.
That's great. And that's a nice rescuing of mockery that doesn't have to go to mean. Yes, Rick. And then we're going to go forward. Okay. By the way, welcome, Kvod Harav. Rabbi Andy Green has joined the Zoom. Baruch haba. I don't know if you just want to give a message to your family or want to study Torah, but it was wonderful to have you here. Go ahead, Rick.
So only because Marshall took us there, if you look at 17, you have Mis Tolel, which to my ear sounds a little bit like Bit Alal. So it's a play on words. It's a linguistic thing that you were trying to exalt yourself against my people is 17, right after that Lema'an,
and now
16, and now it's the other way.
Nice. Okay, let's read verse 3. Sue, you want to read verse 3?
Sure. Okay. Vayavo Moshe v'Aaron el Paro, vayomru elav, Ko Amar Adonai Elohei ha'ivrim, admatai me'anta le'anot mipanav shalachami v'yavduni.
Okay.
Yeah, yavduni. Okay. Now I lost it. Okay. And Moses and Aaron, they came to Pharaoh and they said to him, God says thusly, God says the God of the Hebrews says, until when will you, Me'anta, will you
know what lema'ain means?
Prevent.
What's the most famous use of this root in the Torah? A Torah reader knows it. Rick, give him the microphone. Why do you know it?
Vayama'ain has a shalshelet. There's only 4 in the Torah.
Right. When
he
Joseph
refuses Potiphar's wife.
Correct.
I learned from you that Jacob was the doppelganger, or Joseph was. So he's being chased around the bedroom. He's seeing the mirror. He sees Jacob's face. All that. By Yema'ain, he refuses.
Correct. When he resists the urge of Potiphar's wife. So that's a famous use of that root. And here it's interesting. Tense is different in different languages. Ad matai, until when. In English, that would demand a future tense verb. Until when will you? But here it's ad matai me'anta. Until when have you? Did you? it's just hard to make sense of tense in Hebrew, but we understand the meaning, right? For how long are you going to, will you refuse? Refuse what? Lay on note. What do you think lay on note means, Sue?
Leonot, I'm guessing bow, like Leonot. I don't know what root it's from. To answer, to be, is it to answer? When will you refuse to answer me?
If it would be la anot in the pa'al, it would be to answer. Lay anot kind of looks like a nifal, like to allow something to be done to you. And another possible meaning of ayin nun hey or ayin nun yud is not only answer, but this is relevant because we talked about it in Pesach weeks ago, but torture, affliction, oppression, right? The reason why we fast because the Torah says, ta'anu et nafshotechem. You are supposed to afflict your souls. Lechem oni. This is the bread of
affliction.
We normally translate as affliction. There are many commentaries on it, right? So ayin nun yud can mean humility, right? It's related to anav, right? Moshe anav mikol adam. It's not this. It's similar. It's not the same root, right? Ayin nun vav versus ayin nun yud or hey, and this is not reflexive, but the passive. Something like, until when have you refused? How long you refuse? Lay on note to allow yourself to be ani, poor, humble. Where? Mipanai. What's the mipanai, Sue?
In my in my eyes, in my face.
How long will you refuse to recognize that I'm bigger than you? How long will you refuse to allow yourself to actually have the humility that eventually you're going to have?
Picturing that this is Moshe saying this, that this is what God says. This is what God, the God of the Hebrews, has to say. No.
Correct. And then and therefore, shalach ami v'yavduni.
Yes. Send my people out so that they can serve me.
Good. Okay. So Rashi has something to say in this verse, but let's see if you guys have something to say in this verse. I see Larry and Diane's hand first.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying something about verse 1 that I don't think we said. So in verse 1, God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh. But what is he supposed to go to Pharaoh for? He doesn't say and tell him blah, 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 blah. He says, go to Pharaoh for, I'm reading the translation, I've hardened his heart and hearts of his courtiers in order that he may display his signs. So maybe what Moses should do is go to Pharaoh and say, God's hardening your heart so that he can punish you more. But he doesn't say that. He says to Pharaoh, hey, it's your fault. But he knows it's not his fault, Pharaoh's fault. He knows that it's God that's orchestrating this. There's either a dual game going on, or, outrageously I'll propose, this is actually two stories being blended together. One story is Pharaoh has agency and is responsible, which is what we're reading here. And the other story, on top of it, is God is toying, mocking. And they're being put together. That's the only explanation I can give, because otherwise, I'm not really happy with the game that Moses is playing here.
You're positing the holy editor, or the non-holy editor, or the prosaic editor. Barry, and then Sue, is your hand up?
Yeah, but go to Barry first.
Barry first?
Yeah.
I'm going back to the concept of self-mockery, that these are stages of Egyptians, Pharaoh going through successive stages of self-mockery, that they will be humbled before God. Humility doesn't happen until experiencing self-mockery.
Yeah, often, right? It's rare for it to just happen spontaneously. People just to get that they need to be humble about something. Anything else on the words themselves before we look at the Rashi or the verse? Going once, going twice?
Well, I wanted to say this is not a fully formed thought,
That's okay.
But we always lean into this, the hardening of the heart, the hardening of the heart. If anybody were to say to you something about hardening of the heart, you'd think, oh, Pesach and Pharaoh and whatnot. But it's still a kind of, I think it's for ancient times, it's still an odd way to say this refusal and this building refusal, and his heart is hardened, his heart is hardened. So, of course, that made me think, what the hell did they know? What did those Egyptians know? And what did they know afterwards? Tova maybe can help here. Like, I don't know if when they went to mummify that pharaoh, his heart was hardened like arterial sclerosis. Like was he being afflicted and killed minute by minute, inch by inch, by some very real hardening of the heart?
Anyone have any thoughts on that? Not that we have any possible way to actually answer it, but Tova, go ahead.
Oh, shoot
This
you.
is just
Sorry.
an oddity, if you will. I don't entirely agree with the theory, but if we posit a real pharaoh somehow being engaged in this, it's not 100% clear that Ramesses II would be the one, but one of the early pharaohs of that dynasty, and just a few kings later was Ramesses III, who did indeed die apparently of some kind of heart affliction. And rather remarkably, when he was mummified, his heart was placed not in its usual place, or rather, not that the heart isn't placed there at all, but a scarab of the heart was placed not in the usual place, but on the other side of the chest. And Egyptologists struggled to interpret that and saw it as perhaps trying to remedy whatever had ailed the heart in his lifetime. That's the best I could do.
That's interesting.
Larry, Diane?
So, I don't know if this is an observation or a question, but Moses and Aaron have gone to Pharaoh and they made up something. I mean, if you go back, God hasn't said to them, this is what you should say to Pharaoh. Just unless, I mean, the last thing that happened before this was the hail. And so now they're saying, how long will we refuse? I mean, where does this come from?
Right. And there in the many, many interactions between God and Moses, and then God and Moses and Aaron, and then Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, it's not always the case that before Moses and Aaron, we're told what Moses and Aaron say to Pharaoh in quotations, that God told them to say those words beforehand, right? Sometimes we can either posit that they took it upon themselves, or that the Torah was terse and doesn't repeat things twice. Doesn't say, God said to Moses and Aaron, tell Pharaoh this, da-da-da-da, and Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and told him this, da-da-da-da. Sometimes there's a redundancy, sometimes there's not. But you're right, and particularly this new language, ad matai me'anta le'omi panai, is that, I think the question you're asking, is that Moses and Aaron's construction, or did they hear or intuit that from God because it's new language for us?
Right.
Yeah. Rebecca, and then Tova, and then we'll look at Rashi.
On a different matter, I was just noticing how God identifies himself as Adonai Elohei HaIvrim, the God of the Hebrews. But when it talks about Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, when they're relating to Pharaoh, or they're doing things, or they didn't get their cattle didn't get affected, or Pharaoh didn't send them away, it's interesting that it's the two names. Is there reason for that?
Two names being Elohei,
Bnei Yisrael or HaIvrim.
Yeah.
It's always the God of the Ivrim, of the Hebrews, but when the people are doing something, they're not called the Ivrim, they're called Bnei Yisrael or Yisrael.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question. You're saying that in the narrative itself, our people are referred to as Israel, but at least sometimes God is referred to in the narrative as the God of the Hebrews.
Right.
The last one was 9:13.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that seems consistent that it's the God of the Hebrews, but I see various places in the narrative it's always Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question points without a clear answer to perhaps the difference between the way in which the contemporaneous people were understood, at least according to the Torah's imagination, by other people living at that time, versus how over time, it's certainly when Torah emerges, how the people were known then, right? Like if you take a non every word was given at Mount Sinai version of the Torah, by the time the Torah comes into formation, it may be that the only way the Torah wants to refer to these people, even these people back then, are Israel. But in the conversations between the people back then and Pharaoh, the language that's being used is the language that the Torah is guessing Pharaoh might have known those people to be, which is Ha'ivrim, right? And it's just so hard to play both games. It's hard to play the game of when did the Hebrews become the Israelites in real time, and when did the Israelites' self-assessment of themselves, as they were talking about themselves, switch to being Israel, not Hebrews, right? The Ivrim, right, the ones who kind of crossed over, that may have just been, the way the other tribes. If we go pure anthropology and history and forget religion for a second, which is a weird thing to say, right? It's more likely that other tribes and nations knew our nation not by our internal name that we called ourselves because one of our ancestors changed his name in the middle of the night with the fight with the angel, but how we were known amongst the ancient world as the ones who crossed from there to there. So it's a great question. I don't, and that's just an instinctive answer.
Rabbi, in chapter 9, verse 1 and then verse 13, God tells Moses, when you go talk to Pharaoh, say that Adonai, God of the Hebrews, says this and that. He tells Moses to use that term. I've been trying to find out if it goes on before that or not.
Right. Correct. In 9:1, God explicitly tells Moses to tell Pharaoh to use my name, and my name in that sentence should be Elohei Ha'ivrim, right? The God of the Hebrews. And what Rebecca's pointing out is that when the story is just being told narratively about what happened, our people are being referred to it not as Ivrim, but the where the Israelites were living in Goshen, hail didn't fall or something like that. Yeah. Okay, Sue. You're muted. Yeah.
Okay. Can I say something about Ivrim? And then I will read the Rashi.
Go ahead.
Wait, the Ivrim first or the Rashi first?
Ivrim and then Rashi.
Well, I just thought, what if what if this reference to the Ivrim? I know it's like Ivrim from Lavor, and we were the people who passed by and whatever. But what if there's something in there about Ivrim as the blind also, and that for this time that we were in Egypt, we were blinded to our real purpose or our real peoplehood.
Lovely midrash. And you could play it. Ivrim, blind, is ayin vav, not ayin vet. Letter. But listen, the rabbis do that all the time. Al tikra ivrim bet, ela tikra'u ivrim vav, and I'll go with you. I'll listen to that sermon. But it's a.
I'll write it up.
Okay.
Okay.
Rashi on lay on note. So Rashi's first comment, actually only comment on verse 3.
Okay. Ke targumo. Le'it kna'a with an aleph.
Le'it kna'a. So Targumo means what?
It means according to Unkelus.
According to Unkelus. So Rashi says, "Hey, reader, whatever generation you're reading this in, you're trying to figure out what does le'not mean. Be guided by Unkelus's translation from 1,000 years before Rashi lived or so. Le'it kna'a, which only helps if you know what le'it kna'a means, right? That you can pull out the Hebrew root kaf nun ayin. Anyone know what kaf nun ayin means in Hebrew? To submit or to yield, right? Hachna'a's submission. Like lehikana means to eventually cry uncle, to give up, right? So this is the Aramaic infinitive of the Hebrew lehichana, which means to give in, right? So Rashi says le'anot here means something like to give in, and now he expands it a bit.
V'hu mi gizrat ani me'anta liot ani v'shafal mipanai. Okay. It's from the Gizrat. It's from the form.
Right.
Of,
Gizra, remember, is Rashi's word for shoresh.
okay.
It's the root. Yeah.
From the root of ani, like Anya, like alachma Anya, like we were just saying, no?
Low, submissive, humble, oppressed, right? Okay.
Right. Me anta liot ani v'shafal mipanav mipana. You have refused to bow low before me.
Yeah, you have refused liot bi ani, right, and low before me. And what's wonderful about this is that just think of the inversion going on here, because one of the reasons why we say zelechem oni is because this is the bread of our affliction, because we were afflicted in Egypt. And Rashi's basically saying what Pharaoh's being told is you're refusing to just flip places with the Israelites, but it's inevitable, right? You think you're on top and the Israelites are below, and they're the ones experiencing oni. Guess what? I'm on top and you're below. And you're refusing to acknowledge that. You're refusing to acknowledge that you have become the Israelites, at least to me. Right? How long is that going to go on? Going back to, I forgot who already asked this, right? Is this, Diane, is this Moses and Aaron's initiative to introduce this language, or did God whisper in their ears, say these words? But the playing with the ani here is really wonderful, particularly as we remember this story and we tell it now. Stevie, Marshall.
Yeah. One possible take is that Moses just heard in the last verse that God is going to, do this until the story could be told that Pharaoh was humbled, and now he's saying, like, get it over with, right? Like, this is only going to get worse for you, so like, do it now.
Okay, good. Marshall, and I'm going to share one super commentary on Rashi, and then we'll keep going.
Although we said that the shoresh had to do with be submissive or ani,
yeah,
I thought maybe a note to answer, lay a note to be answerable.
To be answerable. Interesting.
To God.
How long will you refuse to provide? Yeah, good. That works too. There's a super commentary in Rashi, the Mizrahi, who splits apart the ani meaning humble and the ani meaning afflicted, right? I tend to think of them as actually the same root with multiple forms. He says they're actually, I'm not sure if he's saying they're actually two roots, but don't read this as saying, how long will you refuse to suffer in my presence, but rather, how long will you refuse to allow yourself to be humble in my presence? And his answer is, he's already suffered, right? The problem isn't that he hasn't suffered. The problem is he hasn't acknowledged that the suffering should make him humble. So it's an interesting splitting of the hair, because if the root of ayin nun hey ayin nun yud, that doesn't mean answer, has to do with low and affliction and suffering. Mizrahi says even there you can split it off. There's no one can argue as we're heading to the 8th plague that there has not been suffering on Pharaoh's part, but hasn't done anything yet. He hasn't permitted himself to be humbled as a result. His people have suffered. Egypt has suffered. He suffered a little bit too. Okay. Let's at least start verse 3, and we'll do verse 4. Rashi is quiet in this verse, so when we come back to this next week, we'll read another commentary. Rashi doesn't pick up until verse 5. Elon, we haven't heard from you today. Can you come out of your morning from last night and read verse 4?
Sure. כי אם מאין אתה לשלח את עמי, הנני מביא מחר הרבה בגבולך.
Okay, so a compact verse. To me, I don't want to lead the witness too much. There's really I find one particularly interesting, noteworthy, question-worthy word in this verse. Translate, and then we'll see if we can agree on that. And we don't have to.
Because if you refuse to send my people, behold, I will bring tomorrow locusts within your borders.
Great. Okay. So it's not a complex construction of a verse, right? The first part of the verse kind of echoes what we just read. So I just accused you of refusing to be humble, and now I use the word I meaning God. I use I meaning God, but in Moses and Pharaoh's mouth. If you continue to refuse not to be humble, but to actually do the thing I want you to do to send my people, behold, I meaning God, as Pharaoh and Aaron, as Moses and Aaron sang him, will bring machar, tomorrow, arbeh, locusts, big vulecha, in your borders. Questions on the verse, things in the verse that seem interesting or worthy of a query. Rick.
The trope on machar, it's a tavir. So you go down, you come up. So it's like God is bringing the locusts up. It's just a directional kind of thing.
Okay, so that the locusts are, I don't know, don't locusts come from the top though? Don't they come down?
They're on the ground.
How about the cicadas? Anything else on the verse? If again, to lead you a bit, does anyone find any of these words in the category of Ze Omer Darsheni? This word is kind of begging for a midrash. All right, I'll yeah, Rebecca.
Well, the word arba, which is translated as locusts, must really be like a swarm, a kind of a singular collective.
Because the word Rav in the middle of it?
Ah.
Is that what you were
no,
saying?
because it sounds singular.
Okay, good. So arbe is a singular word. Remember the big frog, right? I don't think there's actually a similar midrash on this that I'm aware of, but you could read this as tomorrow I'm going to bring a locust, right? Where this might just be a singular word denoting a swarm. There are some people, I don't think we're going to read this inside in the commentaries next week, but some people try to figure out why the word arbe means the word arbe, and they play with the fact of rav, that they come in great quantities and they consume a great quantity. So what does arbe literally mean? I will increase, arbe. It also could just mean that that's an ancient Semitic word for locust. I don't know, but that game is played. To me, what's that?
We have the meat.
To me, the fascinating word is machar, right? Like sometimes the plague begins immediately. So it's interesting that God has apparently told Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh that not, by the way, look out your window, there are locusts. I'm just letting you know, tomorrow, locusts are going to come, right? Now, we could possibly throw out some answers to that question, but I think it's an interesting question as to why the next plague is coming with some kind of a delay between the announcement of it and its arrival. Okay, so we'll begin there next week. Rashi will say something about that. Elon, is your hand up? You want to say a last word?
Yeah, I was just going to say there are times in the past where there has been a heads up, right? So this is not an isolated occurrence for hey, if you don't do something, you're going to be screwed, right?
Right. There have been warnings. We'll look next week to see if the warning has been expressed in this particular way before. Have a good week, everybody.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.